Entitlement. It may not be one of the 7 deadly sins, but it plays into a few of those unsavory behaviors. It presents itself in various forms and severities, yet most of us would argue that no prize is worth familicide. However, the main character in this story clearly missed this message. Now, we have all had some form of experience with self-entitled people. However, as you will soon find out, Suzane Von Richthofen and her deathly actions would take the golden crown to this title. Hello there folks, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to another video by Coffeehouse Crime. Just a quick reminder that I post solved, unsolved and strange cases here weekly, so if true crime is your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to Coffeehouse Crime. Now with that said, go grab yourself a coffee. This is the case of Suzane Von Richthofen. Much like other recent videos, this case brings us to another new country for Coffeehouse Crime. So in that regard, bom dia, Brazil. Welcome to the vast and colourful country of Brazil, folks. With just over 200 million residents spread over 3 million square miles, this country is immense by all standards. The Amazon rainforest covers more than 60% of the country. Often referred to as the lungs of the world, more than 3 million species live here, making it one of the most diverse places on Earth. But moving away from its gorgeous terrain, we set our sights on the megacity of Sao Paulo. Now, Rio de Janeiro may be the country's most famous city, but Sao Paulo is Brazil's most populous. It serves as the country's economic heart, with numerous cultural institutions and a rich architectural tradition. More than $200 billion flow through the city every single year, and more than 4,500 families within Sao Paulo's borders are classed as millionaires. This financial figure brings us to the Von Richthofen family, an extremely affluent family living in the suburbs of Sao Paulo. Their small family mansion, found south of the city in the suburb of Brooklyn, is valued at 3 million Brazilian real, the equivalent of $600,000. And alongside their multiple bedrooms, they had a swimming pool, an office, and even a library. On the outside, exposed brickwork lay as a dramatic backdrop to the dark iron gates and exotic plants. And found within these 4 great walls was the Von Richthofen family. Beginning with their father, Manfred Albert von Richthofen was a talented German engineer and the director of Dursa, a state-owned company which managed the many highways and roads leading out of Sao Paulo. His wife, Mauricia, was a psychiatrist in the local area. The two met while Manfred was studying civil engineering at the University of Sao Paulo, and it's reported that it was love at first sight. Her outgoing and friendly demeanour complemented his quiet and gentle nature. The two eventually married in the 70s, and shortly after this, they began to think about having kids. It was in the year 1983 that the first child, Suzane Von Richthofen, was brought into this world. Suzane was born on November 3rd, 1983, and 4 years after this, her younger brother Andreas was born. The two children grew up in a privileged household, and although they had it good, nothing is outstanding about their earlier years. The two were educated in the city's most elite private schools, and as a result, they were academically gifted. Focusing on Suzane for just a moment, she was described as a quiet young girl who was often shy. She wasn't the most popular of children, but she did have several friends, and maintained a good relationship with her parents and brother. Growing up, she learned to speak 3 languages, and after graduating from a German high school, she moved on to study law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo. And surely, if studying law, she would be a law-abiding citizen. Despite striving for a successful and professional future, she didn't actually have to worry about money, as, quite simply, her parents were loaded. Now, it's estimated that the Von Richthofen family's wealth sat around the $17 million mark. And to add to this, it is rumoured that Suzane's father had another 10 million euros embezzled in a Swiss bank account. And lucky for Suzane, but all of this money was planned to go to her as soon as she finished her studies, as the Swiss bank account was opened in her name. Yes, Suzane had it all. A comfortable childhood, a great education, and 10 million euros in the bank. All she had to do was wait, and be a good person. But this story sounds too easy for Coffeehouse Crime. And do you really think that's what she was going to do? We're moving forward to the summer of 2002. The relationship between Suzane and her parents had come to a rather bumpy road. And with Suzane 18 at the time, you can probably guess what this was about. Love, not money. About 3 years prior, in August of 1999, the Von Richthofen family had attended a model aircraft fair in Ibirapuera Park. Andreas had grown an interest for model aeroplanes, and while here, he had started talking to an older boy named Daniel Kravanos. Daniel, who was 19 years old at the time, had a knack for building model airplanes. And with Andreas's growing passion, he asked his parents if they could pay Daniel to teach him. They accepted the offer, and fast forward a few weeks later, and while teaching Andreas, Daniel unexpectedly caught the attention of an unfamiliar face. It was Andreas's sister, Suzane. Interesting side note, but many Western articles, including Wikipedia, claim that Daniel and Suzane met at a kickboxing class, but this is untrue. Before actually attending these classes, they had known each other for a couple of months already. Daniel and Suzane would almost immediately hit it off. They say that opposites attract, and here is a perfect example. Where Suzane was privileged and well educated, Daniel had a very different upbringing. Like many families experiencing the Great Wealth Divide in Sao Paulo, he came from a low-income background. Both Daniel and his older brother Christian were mechanics at the local garage. They had dropped out of school at a relatively young age, meaning that they had failed to finish their education. And for a well-kept and shy young woman, Daniel's boisterous and rebellious attitude intrigued her. But unsure of how her parents would take to a relationship with Daniel, she initially decided to keep this one a secret. As the months ticked by, Suzane's relationship with Daniel eventually revealed itself to her parents. And although they were not particularly concerned at first, and even allowed her to date him, they would eventually change their minds once they learned more about him. Because although Daniel had claimed to be a law student and was initially building model airplanes, he had actually dropped out of both ventures. Instead, he smoked weed almost daily. And while not a problem from time to time, this level of dependency made him lazy and paranoid. He had no intention of returning to school or finding a job, and instead was intent with getting baked and spending all of his time with Suzane. Now of course, all parents want the best for their children, and for Manfred and Mauricia, who were both hardworking, wealthy individuals, they could no longer accept their daughter dating him. But the couple had an unusual wingman. Since Andreas adored his sister and saw Daniel as a good friend, he often covered up their behaviour. While the two were off bonking in motels and spending time in Daniel's home, Andreas would make elaborate schemes to excuse Suzane from her parents. The parents, Manfred and Mauricia, took a 1-month holiday to Europe, leaving both Suzane and Andreas free reign of the house. And with Suzane now 18 years old at the time, this was a great opportunity for her to prove her maturity to her parents. But of course, that isn't how it went, and instead she secretly invited Daniel to move into the house. They spent the entire month by the pool, getting drunk and trying various drugs. After returning home and finding out about this, the Von Richthofen household was ablaze with arguments over the following weeks, and with each one, Suzane was getting more and more desperate. She went as far to ask her father if he could buy her an apartment for her and Daniel so they could live happily ever after. And, of course, he said no. Well, actually, he said she could do whatever she liked, so long she did it with her own money. And with that said, he furthermore threatened to cut her off her allowance. Suzane was pissed, but eventually she accepted her defeat, or at least at face value, because in the background she was still dating Daniel. And what the two were planning behind the scenes was truly terrible. November the 1st, 2002. In the early morning hours, the street of Zacarias de Gois erupted with frantic screams. The sound of horror emanated from the Von Richthofen household, as what the children had discovered was blood-curdling. Both Suzane and her brother Andreas had snuck out of the house the night prior, but shortly after sneaking back home, just after 4 AM, they were met with a very gruesome scene. Their mother and father, Mauricia and Manfred, were dead. Responding officers found both bodies in the main bedroom. They had been savagely attacked while asleep, and based on the items in the room, more than one method of murder was used. Mauricia and Manfred had almost been beaten beyond recognition. Strangulation marks around the neck were visible. One seemed to have been waterboarded, and Mauricia had a garbage bag around her head. It appeared as if the family had been robbed. Money had been forcefully extracted from a suitcase, and other areas which contained cash were now empty. But things didn't add up as officers began to look around the property through a more scrutinous lens. For example, the alarm system failed to notify their guard, who was stationed across the street at the time. And in fact, looking at it a little bit more, the alarm system had been disarmed, meaning their killers must have known the code. Additionally, the raided house seemed almost too neat for a crime scene. Papers in the office were thrown uniformly, not something a frantic burglar would do. And the list continued. There were no signs of forced entry, no electronic devices were stolen, and some rooms remained untouched. So, what exactly happened to the Von Richthofens? At first, nobody knew. The media were focused on Andreas and Suzane. Andreas was so upset that reportedly he struggled to breathe for most of the day. And although Suzane seemed upset too, she appeared to be very calm for a girl who had just lost her parents. So, police soon learned of their evening outside of the family home. At around 9 PM, Suzane snuck her brother out of the house to attend a LAN party. Their parents thought he was in bed, asleep. And after dropping him off, Suzane allegedly did her usual night call, and hired a motel with Daniel so the two could smoke and have some fun. But when they returned home at 4 AM, before their parents were up for work, Suzane and Andreas found them murdered in their bed. But this is where several doubts begin to form, because Suzane's statements to police contradicted her brother's. For one, she told officers that her parents supported her and Daniel's relationship, which, as we all know, is total baloney. On November the 1st, Manfred and Mauricia were finally laid to rest. It was noted that Suzane seemed to cry a lot less than her brother did during their funeral. Her rather emotionless demeanour stirred opinions. However, that wasn't the only thing going through people's minds. Rumours that Suzane had hosted a pool party in her home only 3 days after her parents were murdered began to circulate. And to add to this, it was noted how quick her emotions switched between cameras. All of this made authorities rather suspicious. But what set them over the edge was an anonymous tip. A friend had come forward to report a rather suspicious purchase, as just days after their murders, a man had walked into a local motorbike store to purchase a Suzuki GSX. Now, okay, this wasn't necessarily dubious in its own right, but they paid for the entire thing up front only using $100 bills. And furthermore, the one who had made this purchase was a man no other than Christian Kravanos, the man that we all know as Daniel's older brother. Those who knew of Daniel and Christian were rather skeptical of this purchase, as everyone knew that both of them were broke and drug addicts. So following this information, officers brought Christian to the local police station. They then began to press him on the issue, and despite the tough guy facade, he was actually very easy to crack. To their surprise, he admitted to murdering Manfred and Mauricia. And, even worse, Daniel and Suzane had helped him. According to Christian, both Suzane and Daniel had schemed to kill her parents so they could finally be together. And, better yet, so the two could live off the $17 million they would inherit. The other two were arrested immediately, and knowing that the evidence would eventually catch them, Suzane was next in line to confess. Daniel was next, but his statements differed from Suzane's. While she said that money was not part of the motive, he said it very much was. And despite the two of them very much loving each other, almost immediately after being arrested, they seemingly broke apart. Now, despite being taken into custody, Suzane was eventually let out of jail until her trial began almost 4 years after the crime. While allowed to walk free until her trial, Suzane agreed to an interview with local media. During the recording, she cried, blamed Daniel for everything that happened, and claimed that he had destroyed her family. The interview gave a perception of a very distraught and broken young woman. Someone who seemed innocent, missed her mother and father, and was seemingly caught in the crossfire. And although the stunt was likely intended to improve her image, it would actually have the opposite effect. Unknown to her at the time, but a third-party camera had accidentally recorded her lawyer, guiding her to cry and act like a defenseless young woman in the interview. What followed was her acting on his every demand, proving that she was fake and disingenuous.
Sobre o que falar do ex-namorado Daniel Cravinhos e como se comportar diante da câmera.
Acabou, mais nada. Começa a chorar e fala, não quero falar mais. O que ele mandava, fazer. O que ele mandava sempre dizendo que se eu amasse era para fazer. E eu, pelo amor de Deus, não quero mais tocar nesse assunto que me faz muito mal. E chega.
Quero, por favor. Nossa, ontem eu fiquei super ruim, foi super. Eu passei muito mal de noite. Por favor.
I'm also glad she chose a profession in law, because her acting skills are terrible. On July the 17th, 2006, Suzane, Daniel and Christian were put on trial for homicidio qualificado, the equivalent of first-degree murder in Brazilian law. While here, the jury was given the very fine details of what precisely happened on Halloween of 2002. In the late hours of October the 31st, Mauricia and Manfred were fast asleep. It was a Thursday, and both of them had been at work for most of the day. At 9 PM, Andreas snuck out of the house with Suzane. His intentions were innocent enough though. He attended a LAN party. But Suzane, on the other hand, had much more grievous plans. She returned home in her car with Daniel and Christian, and although the family security guard spotted her, he wasn't alarmed to see her. After arriving home, Suzane checked in on her parents to see if they were asleep, and once given the all clear, she then disabled the home alarm. Ushering Christian and Daniel into the living room, the men then equipped themselves with surgical gloves and hoods. Suzane sat on her parents' luxurious sofa, while Daniel and Christian headed upstairs with iron crowbars in hand. Finding Manfred and Mauricia asleep, the two began to beat them repeatedly. But despite the enormous pain levels, the two wouldn't die. In a violent panic to finish the job, the brothers resorted to using towels found in the bathroom. And although, tragically, this would kill Manfred, Mauricia was still alive. Daniel searched for a plastic bag and wrapped it around her head in a cruel and soulless fashion, and a few agonizing minutes later, Mauricia breathed no more. After the deed was done, the trio staged the scene to look like a burglary, spreading several papers in the office and stealing all the money they could find. The three of them then left the property, and to create an alibi afterwards, Christian went to a fast food restaurant where he made sure to be seen. Meanwhile, Daniel and Suzane spent the night together in a motel, doing God knows what, before explicitly asking for an invoice as evidence of being out of the property. At 3:30 in the morning, Suzane picked up Andreas from the LAN party, travelled back to the family household, and pretended to be shocked as she discovered the crime scene. And of course, you already know the rest. During her trial, Suzane blamed everything on Daniel. She tried to claim that he had constantly fed her a cocktail of drugs, and exploited her drowsy state to get her to agree to the murders. But on the other hand, the Kravanos brothers claimed that they were simply acting upon her wishes. They also claimed that her parents were alcoholics and abusers, and that they were simply trying to look out for Suzane's best interests. But to bounce back against this, both Suzane and her brother Andreas rejected these claims, and autopsies detected no alcohol in their bodies. Despite the Kravanos brothers' inconsistencies, Suzane was still not off the hook. In fact, the prosecutor, Roberto Trodelli, branded her as the mastermind behind the crime. She was further described as the perfect personification of the evil blonde, and that all she wanted to do was get her hands on the money and assets that her parents had worked so hard to obtain. In short, she wanted her freedom and independence without working for it. On July the 22nd, 2006, only 5 days after their trial began, Suzane, Daniel and Christian were all found guilty over the murders of Manfred and Mauricia von Richthofen. Prosecutors called for 50 years behind bars, but sadly, none of the three would be given this much a sentence. Suzane and Daniel were sentenced to 40 years in prison, while Christian, on the other hand, was sentenced to 38 years for conspiracy. Now, as you would likely expect from a person so unruling, but Suzane has attempted to reduce or nullify a sentence several times. For example, in 2018, she asked for freedom, citing her egocentrism and personality disorder led her to the crime. Now, of course, this request was denied, as, no surprise, being a self-entitled brat does not excuse murdering your parents. Unfortunately, there were several sad twists in the aftermath of this case. For example, Suzane's brother Andreas never adequately recovered from the death of his parents. In 2017, 3 nervous neighbours had woken up in the middle of the night to find their homes had been broken into. Lying on the floor was a dishevelled man, and when officers arrived, he claimed not to be violent, only that he didn't care about his life and he was scared. The man was Andreas. He had been aimlessly wandering the streets with his family's heirloom in his hands, and he had scars all over his legs. He was admitted to hospital shortly after this. Much like Andreas's mind, the old family house lay frozen in time for many years after the murders. Abandoned, aging, and slowly falling into a state of despair. In the year of 2014, it was sold to unknown buyers, who painted the entire facade white. Not that you can tell this in Google Maps, as the building has mysteriously been blurred out in every street image. At least in my eyes, it feels like Andreas is the main victim here. He was destined for greater things, had an excellent education and professional life ahead of him, and had 2 very loving parents. But in the mere blink of an eye, he lost it all. His sister and friend were behind bars, and his mother and father were dead. It is no surprise that he fell into the darkest of corners of his mind. And although he was admitted at the hospital, it's unclear what he has done with himself since then. One of the craziest parts of this story is that, despite murdering her parents, Suzane is actually likely to inherit their money after she has served her time in prison. This means that, with a sentence of 40 years, she is likely to be free and a multimillionaire by the year 2042. Even now, both Suzane's and Daniel's sentences are being carried out in a semi-open regime. This means they are allowed out of prison for special holidays and even vacations. To make things worse, she has even been spotted at parties while on her holiday parole. This is one of the many interesting details I've learned about international court cases. Apparently, in Brazil, even murderous prisoners receive vacation. It's a shame that, unfortunately, their victims don't. And that just about wraps up today's case, folks. Thank you so much for watching another video today by Coffeehouse Crime, and thank you for being here with me, I really appreciate it. Remember to leave your thoughts in the comments section down below, as they always generate exciting discussions. And until we see each other again, remember to look after each other and stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.